Indeed, Robson does mark the body of his black soldier as powerless and subjects both him and the viewer to a display of violence that becomes part and parcel of the soldier's hysteria, and which I propose acts as an hysterical lynching. Though no standard lynching occurs on screen in Home of the Brave, during key scenes in this film, clips of which I'll show you in a moment, after a series of verbal racial attacks by white soldiers and surrounded by the sounds of physical torture, the black soldier's body performs for the camera and in view of the remaining unaffected white members of his unit what can best be described as the effects of an invisible mob torture that leaves him unconscious and paralyzed. It is this scene that Moss recalls in flashback for the doctor as causally related to his paralysis, and which most powerfully demonstrates the centrality of racial violence to the film's integrationist project. In the latter part of this scene, which I'll screen for you in a moment, while the white soldier Finch is being tortured by the Japanese off-screen, the black soldier begins to suffer physically on-screen. Pacing the beach, Moss becomes overwhelmed by the sounds of Finch's screaming. The other soldiers try to distract Moss, suggesting that animals might have made the noise, but he will have none of it. "That was no bird," he says. "That's Finch, they're killing him," Moss yells at his comrades. But it is not Finch who appears to be dying. Despite Robson's choice to torture the white soldier on the soundtrack, it is the black soldier's body and psyche that come to exhibit the toll before the camera. Moss first paces in circles, then yells, sobs, throws himself on the ground, picks himself up, falls down again, and finally lapses into unconsciousness. And Robson excludes him, like the captured white soldier, from the visual frame for nearly a full 10 minutes of action. It is here, which is rather odd given that the whole film is supposed to be his flashback, but it is here that Robson begins to suggest visually and orally that Moss's suffering is linked to that of the white soldier, and not only in sympathy, but because of its racial significance. Indeed, just following this scene, Moss will beat himself up, as you saw in the beginning clip I showed, and repeat the hateful epithet that Finch did not fully utter. So I want to show you a very quick example before a longer clip of the match between Finch's voice on the soundtrack and Moss's body going through contortions in the frame.
So who cares about Finch?
There's nothing we can do. Thomas, try not to listen. You know the way you do with guns. You don't hear them after a while.
It's not guns.
Pretend it's just yelling. You want to be used to noise and yelling? You're a city kid.
What?
You come from Pittsburgh, don't you? Don't you, Ozzy? They're killing me. That party you and he were going to have. Was it going to be in Pittsburgh, Ozzy? Was it going to be in Pittsburgh, Ozzy? Shit. It's not so bad if he's yelling. You got to be alive to yell.
Major, please.
Don't listen. Tell me about the bar. Tell me. You like poetry? My wife writes poetry. You want to hear some?
I find it amazing that only the black soldier is experiencing this pain. Not just amazing, but important, significant, readable. In the latter part of the scene, which I'll screen in a moment, it'll be my last clip, while the white soldier Finch is being tortured by the Japanese off-screen, the black soldier begins to suffer physically on-screen. He becomes overwhelmed by the screaming. Despite the I'm rereading. So, though Moss is not yet paralyzed in this flashback, not until after the white soldier's torture has resulted in his death, the black soldier's body has begun to exhibit the symptoms for which, again, there is no physical etiology. That is, unless we can credit the white soldier's bodily pain with causing the black soldier's psychic and eventually hysterical physical anguish. And indeed, not only are Finch's screams on the soundtrack matched by Moss's visible contortions as he throws himself about the clearing, but they cease as soon as Moss becomes unconscious, as if they were indeed Moss's and not the white soldier's after all. In the next clip, which follows the one we've just seen, Robson clearly marks as racial, as a part of a history of racial violence, the fused torture of the black and white soldier friends. So this begins with the clip you saw before, just sort of puts it all into context together for you. And this occurs about 10 minutes after the one you just saw. You can see the parallel to the moment where the doctor holds him there as well.
Please don't be dead.
So this is one of the moments where I'm going to argue it becomes really difficult to untangle the bodies. In this scene, Robson's characterization of the black soldier's identification with his white counterpart's torture presents for Home of the Braves viewers the unvisualized but rather embodied legacy of violence against African Americans. When Finch finally crawls out of the jungle and Moss gathers his bloody, tortured body into his arms, the darkness of the shot makes it difficult to discern where the one man begins and the other leaves off. This long shot of Finch, entwined in Moss's embrace, depicts a merging of the white and black soldiers, a visual merging as Moss cradles, rocks, and caresses the dying Finch. It goes on for a lot longer. I took a piece of it out. And a simultaneously physical and psychological merging as Moss experiences unconsciousness and finally paralysis at the end of this, like his fading friend. Indeed, in his attack on himself, his unconsciousness, and his hysterical paralysis, Moss manifests physically the violence perpetrated off-screen on Finch's body. In other words, through his hysteria, Moss experiences the same violence Finch does. He is, in effect, abducted, tortured, and with nigger, nigger, nigger echoing through the clearing, killed. Moss's consciousness, his experience of the violence of war as racial violence, transforms Finch's abduction and murder into what I would like to designate as an hysterical lynching of Moss. A lynching that corresponds to the continued violence occurring in the States in the post-war period. As both the ultimate result and ultimate spectacle of American racism, lynching is, both in this film and in the culture in which it was released, central to the construction of African American identity. At the historical post-war moment of integration, assimilation, and miscegenation, Moss's painful witnessing and his psychic and physical identification with paralyzing bodily violence become the ultimate expressions of black consciousness in Home of the Brave. Resistant through his sickness, Moss expresses a consciousness not only of racial difference, but of history and its legacy of racial violence as well. In Kathy Caruth's words, quote, "In trauma narratives, what returns to haunt the victim, these stories tell us, is the reality of the ways that its violence has not yet been fully known. It is the not yet fully known consciousness of, in part, the legacy of racism that Home of the Brave presents, but cannot resolve in the figure of Moss, the black soldier. Thus it is in the next wave of black filmmakers' efforts to recuperate this damaged consciousness that the figures of Sweetback and the renegade black militants emerge. The black nationalist of the blaxploitation film, not yet paralyzed but active, might appear to stand in stark opposition to the sick black soldier. But as I've shown today, this is the last shot from Sweetback's Badass Song. As I've shown today, he is in fact a response to, even a psychic echo of, the sickened black soldier and the traumatic failures of post-war integration and his illness in acts. Thank you.